Hi, it's me. No, 49. Eyes in the wall. It was a chilling discovery that no one wanted to make, not even the cops who found it. 4 men were standing around a table in the living room of a home. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide with terror. And then there was the 5th man, slumped over the table, his eyes wide open, staring straight ahead at something behind the wall. The first 3 men bolted from the house when they saw the cops, but the 4th man didn't move. It wasn't until the officers approached him and put a hand on his shoulder that he flinched. That was when the cops realized he had been staring directly at them this whole time. He was still looking at them when they took him into custody. And he continued to stare as they drove him down to the station in the squad car. But what was it about the cops that so terrified this man? What did he see in their eyes? Or rather, what didn't he see? At the station, an officer finally worked up the courage to look into the man's eyes, or at least where his eyes should be. They were hollowed-out sockets filled with darkness. The officer screamed and quickly backed away. Maybe the killer had used some sort of hypnotic suggestion to drive his victims insane. Maybe he had tortured them for hours before gouging out their eyes. Maybe he needed more than just their eyes for whatever dark magic he was practicing. The officer shook his head. There had to be a logical explanation. Otherwise, how could anyone ever hope to catch the killer? They managed to get the man to talk after a while. Told him he had been drinking with some friends at the bar when he suddenly felt very ill. He excused himself and went to the bathroom. When he came out, his friends were gone, and there was a note on the table saying they had left without him. Confused, he exited the bar and walked around the block. That's when he saw the house. It looked like a nice place to stay for the night, so he knocked on the door. When someone opened it, he introduced himself and asked if he could use the phone. The person invited him in instead and offered him a drink. The man accepted and soon found himself sitting in the living room with 4 other men. They were all strangers, but they seemed friendly enough. They made small talk for a while, and then one of them excused himself to go to the restroom. Soon after, another man left the room. A few minutes later, both men returned, their faces drained of color. "We have to get out of here," one of them said, his voice shaking. "There's something wrong with this house." The man who had knocked on the door stopped him. "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "Where else would we go?" But the others insisted, and eventually they all agreed to leave. They gathered their things and headed out the front door. That's when they saw the sight that made their blood run cold. Standing in front of them was a tall, thin man with sharp features and glowing red eyes. He was dressed in black from head to toe and wore a silver mask that covered the upper half of his face. His expression was cruel and mocking. One of the men screamed and turned to run, but the stranger raised his hand and snapped his fingers. In an instant, the man froze and crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with terror. The others screamed and scattered in different directions, but it was no use. Wherever they went, they saw the same horrifying sight, the man with glowing red eyes and the cruel, mocking expression on his face. They ran back to the house, but the door was locked. The man with the mask stood outside, blocking their only way out. He beckoned with a finger, and the 4 men had no choice but to go back inside. They spent the next few hours huddled together in the living room, too afraid to move or make a sound. Then they heard footsteps coming down the stairs. The tall man entered the room and motioned for them to come closer. They obeyed, their eyes never leaving his. The man gestured toward the television, and they all stared at the screen. On the TV, they saw images of themselves, their faces distorted and grotesque. The man with the mask leaned closer and whispered something into the ear of the man who had knocked on the door. The man nodded slowly and turned to face the camera. He knew what he had to do. When the cops arrived, the man had already called 911 on himself. He confessed everything to them, but they didn't believe him. They thought he was trying to cover for his friends. Only when they searched the rest of the house did they find the bodies. The man who had knocked on the door was taken to a hospital, where he remained for several weeks. During that time, he underwent extensive psychological testing, but no one could figure out what had happened to him. He couldn't remember much about his life before the incident. He didn't know where he lived or worked or even what he did for a living. He had no one who cared about him or wanted to visit him in the hospital. He was truly a mystery to everyone, including himself. And then one day he woke up from a dream and looked over at the empty space next to him where his 4 poles should have been. It had fallen over and crashed to the floor, but somehow he hadn't been woken up by the noise. He tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy and weak. He struggled to lift his head, and that's when he saw them. The nurse rushed into the room and gasped when she saw what he was staring at. His eyes were wide open and filled with wonder. He was looking directly at the nurse, but he didn't seem to recognize her. She blinked rapidly, and that's when he smiled. "You have beautiful eyes," he said. The nurse screamed and stumbled backward. "What?" The man frowned. He said, "You have beautiful eyes." The nurse shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't see me?" she stammered. "I'm not real. You're hallucinating." The man looked confused. "Why are you hiding behind the bed?" The nurse cried out and hid under the bed. The man got out of bed and walked toward the closet. "Who are you?" he whispered. The man opened the closet door and gasped. Inside, hanging from the rod, was a pair of his own eyes. They were pale and lifeless, staring blankly ahead. He reached out and touched one of his eyes. It felt cold and smooth, like marble. Then he looked back at the closet door. On the other side, he saw his reflection. But it wasn't his face that caught his eye, it was the eyes. They were filled with hate and madness. The man stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who he was, or how he ended up in the hospital. But one thing was clear to him now. Whoever had attacked him had done a terrible thing. The man collapsed to his knees and wept. As the sun rose the next morning, the man sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't want to look in the mirror again. He didn't want to see the hate and madness in his own eyes. He was afraid of what he might find. In the end, the man was never able to recover from his ordeal. He spent the rest of his life in mental hospitals, never quite right again. Some people say he was lucky to survive the attack, but is that really true? Would you rather be dead or live a life like his? Thanks for watching. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more content. See you next time. Bye.